Specialization or specificity is often associated with strength sports, where it has a tangible and practical application to a specific goal. When you apply those principles to bodybuilding, you quickly realize they're useless, at least in terms of competing. But what if specializing in a lift has its own benefits that indirectly improve your results from a hypertrophy perspective? Is specializing in a lift now worth it, even if you can't tell by looking at your muscles what lift you use to build them? I can tell you that specialization is useful and has its benefits, but what good is knowing something without understanding it? You could walk away from this video thinking that specialization is a new tool for you to use, but what if you go on Instagram after and someone tells you variety is key? Now which one do you stick with? This is where paralysis by analysis begins to creep in. You don't know what to pick, and you don't know how to properly analyze the information in front of you either. So many lifters have an underwhelming amount of conviction in their methods that they jump ship whenever a seemingly faster boat arrives, only to realize it has its own flaws and was going in the wrong direction anyways. So what if there was a benefit to staying on that same ship, even if it does have some flaws? There are no perfect programs, no perfect lifts, but instead of stressing about the 10% of a lift or program that sucks, why not make the 90% as excellent as possible and focus on that? As far as specializing in a lift goes, I'm no stranger to it. I've dabbled in powerlifting and recently grew my arms from 16.5 to 18 inches using basically 2 lifts the entire time. Of course, with a little variety to kind of round things out, but basically 2 lifts for the bread and butter. My philosophy towards specialization has changed a fair amount throughout my lifting career, but after a long 8 years of lifting, I've got a firm grasp on this approach as a whole. When it comes to powerlifting, specialization is key. You're competing in 3 different lifts, and not just these specific lifts. You're doing them in a specific way, determined by someone else, and you're doing one single rep. Not a lot of wiggle room there. Sure, you can train with variations that carry over to your competition style lift, but they're not the lift you're competing in, so they'll always be accessory lifts. This type of approach holds you back in bodybuilding. Of course, the principle of specialization remains the same. The difference is who dictates what you specialize in. Powerlifting could be described as a restrictive approach, along the lines of a government that flexes its authority a little too much. It's cool to have standardization and equality, but a little freedom would be nice, right? Bodybuilding is exactly that. It's as free as it gets. It's basically classified as a strength sport, yet you don't need to compete in a single lift to compete or even succeed in bodybuilding. If you want to build your physique with barbells, rings, bands, whatever, you can do it however you want to. But what you'll quickly realize is that freedom isn't all sunshine. You need to have some restrictions. The secret is that personal discipline and personal restriction is what you need to succeed within personal freedom, and specializing in a lift of your choice is exactly that. Power building has been a popular but fairly obscure approach over the last decade, and to me it embodies both extremes simultaneously, when in practice the happy medium between the two is going to be best. Not in terms of workload aimed at powerlifting or bodybuilding, but combining each approach to reap the rewards of the strictness of powerlifting and the freedom of bodybuilding. Specialization works for powerlifters because it forces them to commit. The biggest thing that holds new lifters back is a fear of commitment. That's the root cause of program hopping. A lifter tries a new lift. It's fun and exciting, but the novelty quickly evaporates. Your technique improves and your new gains dry up, so progression slows, which annoys the analytic types. The pumps become less potent as you adapt, along with the mind-muscle connection. I'd be lying if I said this didn't annoy me, but when you zoom out, it's easy to accept that for what it is. A smaller detail of a bigger picture. Barbell Apparel, the sponsor of my channel and in this video in particular, they make the best shorts I've ever worn. The Phantom shorts are absolutely unreal. These are the ones that you see me wear in my full-on lifting vlogs, and for someone that genuinely does not train legs enough at all, I train them hard, but I only train them like once a week for a couple sets. People are telling me my legs look good, and I swear it's not because my legs are impressive, it's purely because of these shorts. They're a 7-inch inseam, and they fit perfectly. So even myself, who has like intermediate legs at best. They make my legs look twice as jacked as they are. I highly suggest getting these shorts if you're looking for a new pair. Check them out, they'll be in the description. So when a powerlifter goes through those same stages on the bench press, they might have those same feelings of being frustrated or annoyed, but their feelings don't override their decision making. It's bench press or nothing. There is no way out. In bodybuilding, if you go through those stages, you have the option of just doing a different lift where you allow your feelings to override your discipline or lack thereof. And it's really as simple as that. That's exactly why so many lifters get stuck in the intermediate phase, or worse, never even make it there to begin with. They have too much freedom. The magic from specializing in a lift comes from embracing the difficult path. It sounds completely backwards and counterintuitive, but that's actually a good thing for building muscle. Your instincts are literally against you. Let's compare two different lifters, starting with this creative name I came up with, Lifter 1. Lifter 1 picks a lift, tries it out, and loves it. He isn't thinking about any other lifts because nothing has felt as good as this new lift. Week over week, he improves a little bit technique-wise and is able to add a little bit of weight or reps here and there. He notices that the pump and the sensation he gets while lifting starts to decrease a little bit each time, and the feeling of fatigue, of course, starts to increase a little bit each time, so it feels worse and it gets harder every single time. It's less enjoyable and harder simultaneously. All of a sudden, adding weight is getting more difficult, and 3 weeks later, he's only added 1 rep to his top set. Beating this plateau seems like trying to jump over a 10-foot wall. Without realizing it, other lifts are starting to look much more appealing. The one he's been doing for the last few weeks isn't perfect biomechanically anyways. Someone on Instagram said it's A tier, not S tier. So it's probably time to rotate lifts. In a moment of weakness, he tries a new lift. Fast forward 6 weeks later, and he's gone through that same process now twice. Now let's go to Lifter 2. And I'm sure for Lifter 1, we all have that lift in mind that kind of relates to that. So for Lifter 2, this guy goes through that same process. But when he gets to the crossroads, he takes a different approach. Instead of going from one extreme to the other of seeing the lift he initially picked up to be the best thing in the world on week 1, to a 10-foot tall wall he has to jump over by week 6, he decides to embrace the difficult route and see that wall, and see what that wall is all about. When he looks at the wall, it's not as daunting as it seems, and his goal is to eventually get over it. The more he trains, the more he learns about lifting and how he responds to it individually. Eventually, the wall just kind of disappears and he continues to make progress. When you take that perspective, it's a simple concept to understand, but now that you understand it, you need the self-awareness to recognize when you think more like Lifter 1 versus Lifter 2. You might have a few lifts that you approach like Lifter 2, but what about everything else? How many people train their arms, or really anything that isn't squat, bench, deadlift like Lifter 1? It's a lot more than you'd think. To get into a more practical discussion of specialization, let's talk about how to apply it to your bodybuilding training. The key here is to shift your perspective. It's not so much about picking the lift you think is best, or telling yourself you could be an unconventional lifter who uses pause bench instead of touch and go bench as your main pressing variation. I'm talking a complete 180 and picking your lifts based on the muscle group you want to grow, not the movement pattern itself. Instead of feeling pressure to only do quote-unquote big compound movements, you now have to pick a lift for every muscle that grows better from isolation, forcing the hierarchy within your way of thinking to be disrupted. After all, compound versus isolation movements only differ through the amount of joints going through an active range of motion during that lift. Do you really think that matters much? The only argument you can make, aside from growing multiple muscle groups on one lift, which is overblown by the way, is that compound lifts are more stable because the weight remains over or under your center of mass, and isolations function on a pendulum. But external stability solves that issue, which will equate your force output and improve it in isolations due to the target muscle being guaranteed as the prime mover. Think about preacher curls. Now that you have your exercise selection for your muscle groups, it's a good idea to find a way to standardize them to track progress. Some lifts this is overrated for. It can be quite distracting, But overall, I think it's a good thing to practice. Just don't get lost in the numbers. Find that happy medium where you can use it as a gauge of progress without losing your mind to your own unrealistic expectations. An example of how I standardize my lifts is this. I'll pick a desired setup, so things like stance, grip width, bench angles, etc. Then I'll pick my range of motion. This is actually quite easy. For example, on preacher curls, I'll make sure I use the same grip each time, and I make sure I get well beyond parallel for my top set. Other than that, I just control my tempo and I'm good. For my second set, which you could call a back-off set, I standardize this by locking my armpits into the pad so my upper arms remain in contact the entire time, my elbows all the way up to just below my shoulders. I also make sure I don't just go beyond parallel, but I get a full lockout so my arms fully lengthen, they're fully extended all the way at the bottom. For my third set, I do the same as set 2, but I just pause at the bottom for 1 second. All I have to do from there is count my reps and I'm good. And a pro tip for this is to pick lifts with a descending resistance profile. It saves a ton of headaches. Length and bias lifts are almost always a good option anyways, so it really is a win-win. I'm not really sure how to end this video, but I feel like I need to conclude everything and bring it all together. Basically, the secret to making excellent progress as a lifter is to embrace the difficulty of lifting. It's not a feel-good, easygoing hobby, and I'm not saying that to sound hardcore and whatnot. It's just genuinely how it is. It's full of discomfort. When your lifts become more challenging than before, it's a good thing. Instead of beating around the bush and looking for a shiny new object, realize that shiny object has been in front of you this whole time. It's doing the thing you didn't want to do, which is going headfirst into difficult lifts that force you to take your intensity and programming to the next level. No more shying away from the difficult.